they are really going to be able to deliver Israel in a peace deal. So if the U.S. abandoned its support for Israel, I don't think Israel would ever be willing, Labor, Likud, or anything, to ever make any kind of concessions and then you're stuck. So I think there actually is sort of a benefit there in the long term. There are moments when I think that they can be critical. I think that one of the reasons that you're not seeing more Bush administration criticism of settlement policy, for example, they say this publicly, that if the Palestinians were able to crack down or willing to crack down on Hamas and Islamic Jihad, you would see more pressure on Israel on issues like settlements. But I think that there's a reluctance to really criticize Israel right now when you have attacks continuing. Yeah.
You mentioned when you were on the aircraft carrier that the coverage was mixed.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say more about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think everybody sort of watched what was going on. We could see CNN on the carrier that was pumped in, and I just felt that you had all of us embeds sort of all over, and we all had very narrow perspectives. And I remember particularly watching Walter Rogers on CNN sort of racing through the desert. Remember, the screen was kind of green, and everybody was really excited, and he was really excited, and I had no idea what was going on. All I knew was he was racing through the desert for hours, and I didn't think that was like very merited TV coverage. But I think that the journalists were very excited about their technology, and there was too much focus on the reporters as opposed to what was really going on. And that actually some of the best reporting on the war came from reporters who were not embedded, who were actually mingling about. But of course that was very difficult. I had a friend from a British paper who was, nearly killed a half a dozen times because he just didn't know where to go. Iraqis are shooting at you, Americans, and it was very, very dangerous. On the other hand, I think that Americans sort of reading about sort of the units and sort of understanding they got a better sense of what the units are going through and things like that. But if you were watching the war here and you're watching it in Qatar or Europe, you saw different wars. Everybody focused on different things. And our coverage was very, you just had like cameras set up in Baghdad. You couldn't really see interviews with people, and some of it was just the nature of the regime and that reporters were not allowed to stay. And so difficult, I'd say. But I'd say we still don't really have a good sense of how many people were killed and how people were reacting actually during the invasion. And that was something that I felt was really lacking. The big picture. Yeah.
Yes. Could you make a comparison between the Israeli and Palestinian states to the United States and sovereign Native American nations within the country and how they're run? And secondly, has the United Nations ever considered inspecting Israel for illegal weapons violations?
What was the first question? You said U.S. Israel?
No, Israel and Palestinians, those states as compared to sovereign Native American nations within the United States.
What is that? Which states inside the United States? Like our states?
The way they're sovereign Native American nations.
Oh, sovereign Native American nations, sorry.
The way that those two compare.
No, I can't really, because I don't know that issue well enough. And the issue of whether the UN has ever tried to inspect Israel's arsenal, I don't know the answer to that either. I can check that for you, though. Yeah.
I have a simple question. We keep hearing about the nuclear program of Iran. And right now we have a new nuclear program of Iran.
The nuclear program for Iran.
Yeah, we heard about the nuclear program for Syria and Libya. We never heard about the nuclear program for Israel. We have a proposal that says that we have 200 to 500 nuclear warheads in Israel. I don't know what they need it for. So, and also we know that Israeli scientific were kidnapped and he's in jail right now because he's there to get some numbers about the capabilities of Israel.
Who are you talking about? Elchanan? Who are you talking about? The second part, who's kidnapped?
An Israeli scientist who was in Dimona nuclear.
Oh, the Israeli scientist from Dimona who's been kidnapped?
Yes.
Oh, you're talking about Vanunu from
Yes.
Vanunu. Okay.
Can you give us some numbers if you have them, or some estimates about the nuclear capabilities of Israel and compare with the nuclear capabilities of the Middle East?
Well, Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East right now, as far as we know. Iran aspiring. Syria, the U.S. has said that they have nuclear ambitions, but they're more focused right now, I think, on their chemical and biological programs. Libya, I guess there was some accusation that they also sort of seek nuclear weapons. You ask why Israel needs this. Well, I mean, Saddam Hussein was threatening to burn half of Israel. I mean, you've got 22 Arab Muslim countries who don't accept the state of Israel in the region and have threatened it. So I think that's why in the 1960s they made a strategic decision to do what they did. And I guess I think that there's a sense that Israel has this nuclear program for defensive reasons. And that a country like Iraq, for example, why there was concern that they would perhaps go nuclear, because they have used non-conventional weapons on Iran, their neighbor, and on their own people. That sort of the leadership in that sort of the combination of that kind of leader and the non-conventional weapons is what makes it a sort of deadly combination.
How exactly does the Bush administration decide when combatants are terrorists and when they're not? And in that light, what do they have to say about combatants in Israel-Palestine?
Say again, when they say language they use?
Yeah, when exactly does a combatant become a terrorist? And in that light, what do they have to say about the Palestinian combatants?
Right. Well, I think the State Department website defines terrorists, I don't have the definition in front of me, as when a non-political actor uses violence against a civilian target towards a political end. So that groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and I think Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, a Fatah offshoot, are designated terrorist organizations. Now you have, I think they use the term terrorist somewhat loosely right now in Iraq, when you have American soldiers, military installations being targeted, when they refer to that as terrorists, sometimes combatants, sometimes terrorists, but I think sometimes they use the word interchangeably, so I don't know if they've sort of sorted out in their mind when they think somebody's a combatant and when somebody's a terrorist. Yeah.
Ames is currently in the middle of a film festival designed to show the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a Palestinian perspective. And one of the premises that the film series is based upon is that the media coverage of the United States of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is terribly one-sided, terribly pro-Israel. Would you comment on your impression as a professional journalist about the coverage that conflict has had over, say, the past 4 or 5 years, and whether you would agree with that perspective?
The question of media bias. When I lecture before American Jewish audiences, they complain that the coverage is very anti-Israel. And when I lecture before Arab American audiences, they complain the opposite. So I think that there's a lot of feeling in both communities that sometimes the coverage is skewed against them. And I don't really know what to say about it. I personally think that sometimes the bias is in the eye of the reader or the viewer. Other times I feel that the story's they don't get it right. The reporter doesn't get it right, they don't put enough context, they don't explain what was going on. And you really need to make a general statement about the media is impossible, because you've got such a plethora of news outlets. The way Fox covers something, and CNN covers something, and the BBC covers it, and the New York Times, we have to look and sit together and look at the language they use and look how they portrayed it. And I think that there's a variety of media covering the same story 100 different ways. But that in general, I think that the reporters over there, having been a reporter there for 5 years, in general, do the best they can under difficult circumstances. Because when you have an incident in the West Bank or in Israel, you've got 2 different interpretations immediately, generally, of what happened from the Israelis and the Palestinians. And trying to sort out what exactly happened can be quite difficult. And perhaps I think some in the Palestinian American community perhaps think it's skewed towards Israel here. And I bet that they would think that the European coverage is better. Whereas people here in the pro-Israel community, for lack of a better term, would think, oh, it's horrendous over there, it's just a little better. So it's really, I think it depends on your perspective, it depends on which media we're talking about. And what I encourage people to do is when they're reading their paper, to really read it critically and to really highlight the sections that they feel are offensive and talk about it with the editors. And I think that's something that people are mobilizing to do that, I think, in all the communities here that care about the Middle East. Yeah, maybe this will be the last question, and then I'll stick around after if anybody wants to talk.
I have a question. Why does people, if you ever ask yourself, why the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is so important? I can give you an example. In American media, for example, you never hear about Malaysia. I mean, I don't ever remember. The only time you hear about Malaysia is because Malaysian Prime Minister, whatever it was, spoke out and said something about Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I mean, I can name immediately 10 conflicts, horrible, terrible conflicts, with 10 times more people involved in each conflict, maybe 100 times people more involved in each conflict. And we don't know about it. I mean, we know, but we don't hear every day. I mean, what is it?
It's a great question. Sort of the inordinate coverage that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict gets compared to its size. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of this pesky regional conflict. But because of its location in the Middle East, because it's sort of the number one issue that fuels passions in the Middle East, because it's the center of three holy religions, I mean, any number of reasons. But yeah, there have been 3,000 people killed in the current intifada, and I think that's the number of people that die from AIDS every day in Africa or something like that. I mean, issues that we don't read about, or, you know, when you're reading the newspaper and you have, like, the brief that 1,000 people died on a ferry, and, you know, two paragraphs. Whereas in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, the numbers, you know, you have much bigger spreads. I just think that there's for all these reasons, its location, the religious pulls, it's a conflict that a lot of people just care about, so it's become, over the years, a major issue of conflict. Doesn't mean that its coverage necessarily reflects its importance in the world scheme of things. Certainly, you know, what's going on in Colombia or any number of places. But for some reason, it doesn't seem that editors or for whoever decides that that's an issue that is as of much interest to the reading, watching population here. I don't know if that's a good answer. Anyway, is that it? We have one more. Yeah.
What did the Syrian-Israeli peace talks fail, and what's the future of these peace talks?
Okay, Syrian-Israeli peace talks, why did they fail? In Shepherdstown, West Virginia, January 2000, we sat for 10 days, sort of hoping for a breakthrough there. Ostensibly, they failed because there was a leak to an Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, of the draft deal, which wasn't really the draft deal, and the Syrians said, forget it, we're out of here, and they left. I don't think that was the right environment. I think that summit was somewhat premature. And then subsequently, you had, shortly before President Hafez Assad died, later that spring, you had President Clinton, remember, fly to Geneva to meet Hafez al-Assad, promising him that he had gotten a promise from the Israelis to withdraw. I think Assad thought that the Israelis would withdraw all the way to the Sea of Galilee. And in fact, Ehud Barak wanted to keep 40 yards, sort of a 40-yard barrier, and so he left in disgust, and then he died, and that was pretty much the end of it. No more Syrian-Israeli peace talks after that. There was, during the Clinton years, I think, sort of, the Syrian-Israeli peace talks and the Palestinian-Israeli peace talks sort of jockeyed for position, and when one wasn't going well, they turned to the other, instead of sort of having a multilateral format, and sort of each side got upset. Now there doesn't seem to be any movement at all. Washington's sort of evaluating Bashar al-Assad anew. When he first came to office, they had a very positive view of him. Now, I think, post sort of war in Iraq, not feeling that the Syrians have been very helpful, in fact, they've been unhelpful, they're reevaluating him. And no, unless there's some secret channel that I don't know about, doesn't seem to be much movement at all on that front. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming out.